contribute a huge percentage of our net income now, but it provided income that let us buy other things in the past. It taught us a lot of lessons about business, all kinds of things. So we've probably, in terms of what it's done already and where it's going to go over time, probably the single best investment was the first half of GEICO, which we purchased for $40 million. Now, the second half cost us $2 billion. I'm glad I didn't buy it in thirds. But, that $40 million will, for half the company, will turn out very well. But GEICO, some of our businesses have growth potential, some don't. And we don't require growth potential as part of a business. If a business makes good money and we can use it to buy other businesses, one of the advantages of the Berkshire system is we have a tax efficient and kind of frictionless way of moving money to the best opportunities. And GEICO internally has still enormous possibilities for growth. Incidentally, we've I watched that movie and I kept touting the American Express card, but here is our GEICO card, which I'm sure all of you are eligible for. And I don't advise people using credit cards to revolve, but the truth is that people do. So use a GEICO card if you're going to behave in if you're going to charge anything. I still advise you to pay off your account before it starts revolving. And I think it's a terrible mistake for people to get hooked on revolving credit at high interest rates. And that's the first thing I tell students is that if they don't remember anything else I say, just don't fool around with charge cards and run up balances that keep getting larger and larger. But GEICO has well over 6 million customers now. As was mentioned, we entered New Jersey last year. We're adding very rapidly there. It's a great business model, and it's run by a superb human being and businessman, Tony Nicely, and I think it's got a huge potential. But I love them all.
Well, but GEICO, after all, cost $2 billion for the second half and a significant number of tens of millions for the first half. Now, the search expenses that brought us Ajit Jain, now there was an investment that really paid a dividend. I can think of no higher return investment that we've ever made that was better than that one. And I think that's a good life lesson. In other words, getting the right people into your system can frequently be more important than anything else.
Okay, let's try number 2.
Maggie Gilliam from New York City. As someone who visited the New York Stock Exchange at a very early age and have been touting its merits over the years, could you comment a little bit about what you think of the shenanigans going on currently?
Well,
where?
At the exchange.
Oh. Warren, you're so good at this.
Mean it shenanigans or I personally think it would be better if the New York Stock Exchange remained as a neutral, and it's not strictly a nonprofit, it earns some money, but as a not for big profit, we'll put it, institution. I mean, the exchange has done a very good job over centuries. It's one of the most important institutions in the world, and the enemy of investment performance is activity. And the creator of profit in a profit-minded exchange is activity. So I personally would rather not have an exchange which is trying to increase its earnings per share annually and thereby wanting to encourage people to trade more actively and create more income for itself. that will not be, in my view, good for the American investor. So I think that the exchange of yesterday may be better for the American investor than what looks like it may be the exchange of tomorrow. Now, there may be all kinds of reasons that people find compelling why they want to turn it into a for-profit exchange. But I know the American investor will not be better off if volume doubles on the New York Stock Exchange, and I know that the New York Stock Exchange, as a for-profit institution, would be trying to figure out ways to have that volume increase and to perhaps even charge more money one way or the other. I mean, the profit of an exchange, the profit of the people working on it, in a sense, that's the frictional cost of capitalism. That's coming out of the earnings of the businesses. And IBM or General Motors or General Electric will not earn more money because their stock turns over more frequently. I
feel on this one the same as you do. I feel on this one the same as you do, but much more strongly. I think we have lost our way much more strongly. I think we have lost our way when people like the governors of the stock exchange and the CEO fail to realize that they had a duty to the rest of us to act as is exemplars there was of the right behaviors. Once your activity is that freighted with public significance, I think you've got a duty to create the right appearances. You have a duty as an exemplar. I mean, you do not want your first grade school teacher to be fornicating on the floor or drinking booze in the classroom, and similarly, I don't think you want your stock exchange to be all over the headlines with wretched excess. And I certainly don't think you want to turn the major stock exchange of the country into even more of a casino than it is already. I think we have totally lost our way on this stuff. And I agree with Warren that it ought to be a public institution that cares deeply about its duties as exemplar.
I wish I'd gone to first grade where he did.
I didn't hear that.
I wish I'd gone to first grade where you did.
Oh, yeah.
Number 3.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. My name is Glenn Strong. I'm from Canton, Ohio. I want to extend a warm thank you to Warren's daughter, Susan, for the fine introduction that she provided for this gathering.
Thank you.
Also, a special thank you to your wife, Susan. I thank her for the contributions that she made to the company and for the outstanding example that she obviously set for her husband and the many people that she must have come into contact with. Today I'm asking for your opinion on Social Security. Shall we call it the government-sponsored Ponzi scheme for retirees? I am interested in your views on private accounts, age adjustments for retirees, and tax adjustments for the employees. What would you promote if you were in the Oval Office? Thank you.
Yeah, the Social Security was introduced in the, 36 or 37. My grandfather used to have Charlie bring 2 pennies to work at the Buffett and Son grocery store on Saturday in order to pay his share of Social Security. He didn't want Charlie any false ideas that there was a free lunch in this world. And he gave him a half-hour lecture on the evils of socialism. So we've had a lot of exposure to Social Security and the various arguments on it. It was proposed, of course, as insurance because basically that was the only way Roosevelt could get it passed. The idea of transfer payments would not have washed in the 30s, certainly. And I think the first woman that received a Social Security check paid in a total of $22 or something and got $2,400. So it wasn't insurance. It wasn't insurance at all. It's been a transfer payment by the people who are in their productive years to the people who are past their productive years. And we'll get into definitional terms as to whether it's 65 or 67 now, your past productive years. But essentially, it's a transfer payment. I basically believe that anything that would take Social Security payments below their present guaranteed level is a mistake. I think that in this country, extraordinarily rich country, that the people in their productive years can take care of those outside in both areas, even though the ratio of productive to non-productive has changed and is changing. But we take care of our young, and a rich country takes care of its young and it takes care of its old. And incidentally, in taking care of its young, when we educate 5 children in a family, we don't expect that family to pay 5 times the tax or something like that. And we recognize that in taking care of the young, that it should not be based on a per capita basis or based on wired in a way that enables us to get very, very, very rich far beyond any possible needs we could have. And not everybody's wired the same way. Now, if you come into this world wired with an IQ of 85 or something of the sort, or disabled or whatever it may be, you are not going to do as well in a market economy remotely as well as we do. But you still provide much of what makes Charlie and I very rich. And when it comes to fighting in Iraq or something of the sort, that becomes an equal opportunity type thing. But when it comes to making a lot of money, it's not equal opportunity in this country. So I believe that a rich country like ours should not give lower benefits than what takes place now. And I certainly don't think that we've got all kinds of mechanisms for saving that are extremely good. We have 401ks in this country. We have taxes on dividends and capital gains at 15%. So the money I earn gets taxed at a lower rate than the money that a receptionist in our office may earn. And I would not be doing so well if I were stuck over in Bangladesh or someplace. So this society is providing huge benefits to me that other societies would not. And I think that the obligation for the people who do well in this society is to provide a reasonable level of sustenance for those beyond their productive years. We've got the capability to do it. Right now we quit taxing for Social Security at $90,000. But and that means that everybody in my office is paying, or most of them are paying 12.2 or 12.4%, counting what the company contributes toward this. People talk about double taxation of dividends. They're getting taxed for Social Security and they're getting taxed for income on their income, and they're paying a higher rate or an equal rate overall in many cases to the same rate compared to the rate that I pay. And I think that's sort of nonsense in the society. So I don't want to do anything that hurts the level of the bottom 20 or 30% in terms of their income. I see people living with fear about health care, or living with fear about running out of money in their old age. And I think a society should try to minimize the fear that their inhabitants experience. And that doesn't mean just fear of getting mugged or something. It means fear that the last 25 years of their life they're not going to have much income. So I would, and the degree to which the administration or other people are worrying about the deficit in Social Security 25 years out, when they have a $500 billion deficit excluding the Social Security surplus now, it just strikes me as nonsense. Here we are deploring something that's going to happen in 20 years that's a fraction of what is happening right now while they're cheering, basically, and talking about further favoritism in the tax law. So I have great trouble with people that say, that the system can't sustain. Right now, 4.5% of our GDP goes to Social Security. 50 years from now, 6.5%. Well, believe me, our GDP will be far larger 50 years from now, and going from 4% to 6% does not strike me as a terrible prospect. if you ask me what I would do to change it now, I would means test it. I would lift the $90,000 way up. In fact, I might apply it, on all income. Then you'd really get people's attention. But I would gradually, and we're in the process of doing this, but I would certainly increase the retirement age. I mean, the world in 2005 is much different than the world in 1937 in terms of longevity prospects and the ability to function productively. Charlie, what do you say?
Well, that's the view from Berkshire's Democratic chairman. And the odd part of Berkshire on this issue is that the right-wing Republican who is speaking feels more strongly than Warren that the Republicans are out of their cotton-picking minds to be taking on this issue right now. I do not, if the country is going to get richer at 1 or 2% per annum for a long time ahead, and it's going to have more old people who are living longer and spending money on medical care, the idea that eventually a higher share of GDP would be going through Social Security to retirees and so on that we now have is not anathema to me. It's an exactly logical way to be spending money under different circumstances. And if the government runs out a little short of money as it gets more Social Security obligations, I see nothing wrong with having some consumption taxes or whatever to pay in a reasonable way for what is a very reasonable expenditure. Social Security is very successful. Apart from the disability element, which is relatively small, there's practically no fraud. It's hard to fake being dead. And furthermore, it's a reward for work. All kinds of people are working in this country because they want to eventually qualify for Social Security. Just as many people are doing dangerous military service because they want the pension that will come eventually. So Social Security is a very capitalistic institution with profoundly good effects. It's one of the most successful things the government has ever done in terms of efficiency and good effects. And in a Republican administration that may shortly have to do something really unpleasant, like face down North Korea or Iran over atom bombs, is wasting its goodwill over some twaddle that a bunch of economists that haven't thought it through properly devoutly believe. It's a very sad occurrence.
Number 4.
Thank you. Bill Ackman from New York, New York. For the handful of AAA-rated companies, AIG, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and MBIA, are under formal investigation for accounting shenanigans and are in the process of restating their financials. Like Charlie said before, I think of a AAA-rated company as an exemplar, a company that should behave with the highest accounting and ethical standards. My questions this leads me to are, how can investors comfortably invest in any financial service company when a decent percentage of the AAA-rated companies have false and misleading financials? And I guess the follow-up question is, why don't the rating agencies do some independent due diligence from an accounting standpoint so that they can help serve as a watch on this issue?
Well, financial companies are more difficult to analyze than many companies. I mean, it is more. If you take the insurance business, the biggest single element that is very difficult to evaluate, even if you own the company, is the loss and loss adjustment expense reserve, and that has a huge impact on reported earnings of any given period. And the shorter the period, the more the impact can be from just small changes in assumptions. We carry, we'll say, $45 billion of loss reserves, but if I had to bet my life on whether $45 billion turned out to be a little over, a little under, I mean, it'd be I'd think a long time. And you could just as easily have a figure of $45.5 billion or $44.5 billion. And if you were concerned about reporting given earnings in a given period, that would be an easy game to play. In a bank, it basically is whether the loans are any good. And I've been on the boards of banks, and that's, I've gotten surprises. It's tough to tell. It's financial companies. If you're analyzing something like WD-40, or See's Candy, or our brick business, or whatever, they may have good or bad prospects, but you're not likely to be fooling yourself much about what's going on currently. But with financial institutions, it's much tougher. Then you throw in derivatives on top of it, and it's no one probably knows perfectly what some of it, or even within a reasonable range, the exact condition of some of the biggest banks in the world. But that brings you back to the due diligence question of the agencies. You had very high grade, very smart, financially smart people on the boards of both Freddie and Fannie, and yet one was $5 billion and one was apparently $9 billion. Those are big numbers, and I don't think those people were negligent. And it's very, very tough to know precisely what's going on in a financial institution. Charlie and I were directors of Solomon, and Charlie was on the audit committee, and I forget the size of a few of those things that you found, but what wasn't found. And that doesn't mean that people below are crooks or anything like that. It just means that it's very tough with thousands and thousands and thousands of complicated transactions, sometimes involving the computations involving multiple variables. It can be very hard to figure out where things stand at any given moment. And of course, when the numbers get huge on both sides and you get small changes in these huge numbers, they have this incredible effect on quarterly or yearly figures, because it all comes lumped in. Those adjustments come lumped in a short period of time. So I just think you have to accept the fact that insurance, banking, finance companies, we've seen all kinds of finance company, both frauds and just big mistakes over time, just one after another over the years. And it's just a more dangerous field to analyze. It doesn't mean you can't make money on it. We've made a lot of money on it, but it's difficult. Now, obviously, a GEICO, where you're insuring pretty much the same thing, auto drivers, and your statistics are much more valid in something like that than they will be if you're taking something that like asbestos liability. You're subject to far greater errors in estimation. Doesn't mean that people aren't operating in good faith, but I would take the asbestos estimates of the 20 largest insurance companies. I will bet you they're way off, but I don't know in which direction. And that's sort of the nature of financial companies. I wouldn't fault the rating agencies in terms of not being able to dig into the financials and find things that all of the companies that you've talked about have had big name auditors, and our auditors at Berkshire, how many hours did they spend last year? I don't know what it would be, probably 70,000 hours. And I'm sure at other, if you take major banks, they're spending more than that. But, can they be certain of the numbers? I doubt it. Charlie?
Yeah. Warren is obviously correct that where you've got complexity, which by its very nature provides better opportunities to be mistaken and not have it come to notice, or to be fraudulent and have it not be found out, you're going to get more fraud and mistakes than you are if you're selling a business where you shovel sand out of the river and sell it by the truckload. Just as a business that sells natural gas is going to have more explosions than a business that sells sand, a business like these major financial institutions, by its nature, is going to have way more problems. And that will always be true. And it's true when the financial institutions are owned by governments. In fact, some of the worst financial reporting in the world is done by governments. And governments, institutions like government banks in China, etc. So if you don't like the lack of perfect accounting in financial institutions, you're in the wrong world.
Number 5.
Good afternoon, Mr. Buffett, Mr. Munger. Thank you very much for your wisdom and all your investment advice. I'm Adrian Cho, and I'm from Hong Kong. Back in the old days in Hong Kong, when somebody turned 100, they got to have tea at Buckingham Palace with the Queen. I don't know what you have here in America, but I hope that in 2030 we come back to watch you do 50 push-ups at the White House.
It's not the way to bet.
Will you settle for 10?
My question comes in two parts. Firstly, in 1968-69, you liquidated all your partnerships, and I guess aside from your holdings in Berkshire Hathaway, you got completely out of the market and stayed out. In 2000-2001, you mentioned to us that in the coming decade, the markets would go at best nowhere. However, despite $50 billion in cash, you, and therefore us, remain substantially invested in the market. So my first question was, how and why is the investment climate different today than in 1968-69 that makes you comfortable remaining substantially invested?
Yeah, well, we do own certain securities which we probably wouldn't buy at these prices. Some of them we would, some of them we wouldn't. We're not unhappy with anything we own. We're not happy with putting more money in. So we're in a zone in some of those securities where we wouldn't buy and we wouldn't sell. Now, part of it, that decision relates to the kind of quantities that we deal in. I mean, if we owned 100 shares of each one of the stocks that we own, many billions of dollars worth, it would be an easier decision to go in and out. But we would face significant costs, including taxes, but in top of taxes, in trying to go in and out of the big positions we have. And basically, we like the businesses. So we are not unhappy. We may feel like we wouldn't want to buy more here, but we are not unhappy about being in the businesses in which we have big equity holdings. Now, notwithstanding all of that, a lower percentage of our intrinsic value is represented by the common stocks we own than just about at any time of our history, with the exception of a couple, the period right there at the end of 1969 when we liquidated the partnership. So we have not made any big statement by purchases of stocks or the ownership of stocks that says in any way says that we think that this is a particularly attractive time to own them. But we are not unhappy with Coca-Cola. We are not unhappy with American Express. We're not unhappy with Wells Fargo or Moody's. Those are very, very good businesses that we own. Would we be buying them at today's prices if we, well, the answer is we're not. We've got money and we may buy more later on. We're more likely to buy more later on than to sell those sort of investments. But there is a zone which, because of size, because of taxes, where we would neither be a buyer nor a seller. And we do not see lots of attractive stocks, but we also don't think that there's as much silliness in the market by far as there was 5 years ago, roughly. Charlie?
Yeah, one of the things that's interesting about Berkshire lately is that if you take the last 4 or 5 things we did in the stock market with a goodly number of millions, but billions really, but small in relation to Berkshire's overall size, our record is much like it used to be in some of the best days. Where we were able to move around with small amounts of money, the results were quite respectable. But where we were facing the problems of being enormously rich, where we were prevented from the nimble money-making record of the past. I don't think that's a permanent state of affairs, but it's never going away either. But
Explain that one.
Well, what I mean is that I think we may be able to deploy large amounts of money eventually at very satisfactory rates, whereas in recent times we have deployed small amounts of money at very satisfactory rates. and better small than nil. And small is still billions.
Number 6.
Good afternoon. My name is Mike McGowan. I'm from Pasadena, California. I had a pretty good question on Prop 13, but after watching the movie, I don't think I'll ask it.
Good.
What I'd like to ask about, I guess, is one quibble and then a question. The question being about financial education or study of financial history that might help people in handling these markets or in just dealing with investing at or near the apex of Western civilization. When you mentioned your dad's lectures about buy gold back in the 1930s and then saying, well, 60 years later it hasn't done very well, gold was pretty much pegged at a set price back in the 30s for years, and they didn't really let it loose until 1971, and then it caught up, and then it's kind of bounced around. If you looked at gold maybe now and derivatives and real estate bubbles and lots of other things, maybe gold wouldn't be such a bad investment looked at in current terms. So my question would be, do you consider that you have some sort of an obligation or duty as financial exemplars to maybe pay a little attention to that classical kind of gold as the benchmark or the bedrock of a financial system to some extent, and that it might be nice to talk about it in at least your annual letter to your stockholders about how people might protect themselves in what's a fairly bubbleless kind of environment from really the decline in purchasing power or problems caused by the financial domination that we have today. Thanks.
Yeah, I would say that gold would be weighed out on. Yeah, I would say that gold would be weighed out on my list as a store of value. I mean, I would much prefer owning 100 acres of land near here in Nebraska, or an apartment house, or an index fund. Gold, we'll say, was freed up 30 odd years ago, but it adjusted to a market that still, if you go back to 1900, you were talking $20 gold. Well, you take 20 to 400 in 100 years, the Dow went from 60 to 12 or 13,000, and then 12,000 or whatever it might have been in that same period, and paid you dividends during the time you owned it. It was 66, I think, at the start of the century, and I forget when it ended, but it's 11 or 12,000. And like I say, it was paying you something every quarter during that period. And if you own gold, you paid $20 in 1900 or thereabouts, and then we'll say you had it $400 100 years later. And in the meantime, you paid insurance and perhaps some storage cost. It really is not a store of value, and I'm not arguing for paper money, but if you're worried about paper money, and I think it makes a lot of sense to worry about paper money over long periods of time, but it's just about the last thing I would want to own under those circumstances. A farm has utility, an apartment house has utility, a business will produce earnings, and to some businesses will produce them in real terms as they go along. I'd rather have the ability to sell people a pound of candy 20 years from now, and if they're dealing in seashells, I'll get an appropriate number of seashells instead of paper money for it. But I don't see gold as a store of value, and the truth is it hasn't worked very well. But forget about whether it's worked well the last 100 years or the last 50 years or the last 10 years. I see no reason, why it would work well in the future. I forget whether we're turning out about 3,000 or 4,000 tons of gold a year. And, we take it out of the ground in South Africa and we put it in the ground at Fort Knox or someplace, in the New York Fed. I mean, and it doesn't do much along the way for anybody. So I don't know, Charlie, how do you feel about gold?
Well, I think gold was and similar items, that was a great thing to have if you were a well-to-do Jewish family in Vienna in 1935, because you had hazards where that gold had enormous utility to you. But for Berkshire Hathaway sitting here in 2005, it just doesn't interest us at all.
Number 7?
Doesn't interest us at all.
Number 7?
My name is Al Henderson from Minnesota. I'd like to thank both of you for being yourselves and doing so much for all of us and to help enrich ourselves and everyone else. My question I have is, actually, you have already referred to it, that you devote very little time to looking at the total market and look for individual opportunities most. But I was wondering, in the past you made some excellent presentation on points to consider in projecting reasonable 10-year returns for the stock market, and had advised reduced expectations. Where do we stand now on your stock market and economic measurements and expected 10-year returns?
Yeah. Every now and then, I mean, and I really, very infrequently, you probably can say something intelligent about markets as a whole. I mean, you do see circumstances that are extreme enough that you can make a statement that is likely to look reasonably intelligent 5 or 10 years later. And I've seen a few of those times in my lifetime. I mean, and I've spoken out a couple of times, and I did in 69 and 74 and a few times. Most of the time, you're in some in-between zone. Obviously, you get more for your money in equities now than you got, say, in the summer of 1999, which is when I delivered a talk out at Sun Valley that later got turned into an article for Fortune. But that was I spoke out then because it was extreme. I mean, I knew in a general way that I was going to be right, particularly in certain aspects of the market, but I didn't know when, and I didn't know how right or anything of the sort. And you could have done the same thing in the other direction back in the mid-'70s. I think that if you had to make a choice between owning long-term bonds, which are now yielding the Treasury only a little over 4.5%, or owning equities for the next 20 years, and you couldn't make change that decision, I would certainly prefer equities. But I think people that have expectations that they can earn more than 6 or 7% in equities, and certainly when they start expecting double digits, I think the degree that they have expectations they can do that, or that they can find somebody else to do it for them, I think they're making a big mistake. But 6 or 7% is not the end of the world at all. In fact, and it gets treated better tax-wise right now than it has almost really any time in my lifetime. So I don't think we're in bubble type at all valuations in equities, and I don't think we're anywhere remotely close to bargain valuations, and I don't think it's an extreme enough period that you can speak out in some very definitive way about the outlook. But if you told me I had to go away for 20 years and choose between what's obtainable in an index fund of equities or be committed to long-term bonds, I would rather take equities. But I think you will get a chance to do something that is more screamingly intelligent in not too many years, and maybe a lot shorter than the alternatives that you're offered now. Charlie?
Well, I can't improve on that at all.
Well, then we'll go to number 8.
Hello, my name is Hamid Rezapour. I'm from Orinda, California. I had a question about real estate. And I know this question was asked in previous shareholder meetings about how come Berkshire doesn't invest in real estate. And I believe the answer was that we like operating business. So I want to make my question a little bit more specific towards commercial real estate. So considering the characteristics of larger size commercial real estate investments like REITs that can have the behavior and financial returns of an operating business, why not invest in real estate? Is it because you just don't like the returns, or the business is just not attractive?
Yeah, well, Charlie got a start in real estate, right, Charlie?
Yeah, I would say number one, that in a corporation like Berkshire that's taxable under subchapter C of the Internal Revenue Code, owning real estate is grossly disadvantaged compared to owning it directly by individuals such as yourself. That's number one. And number two, investment real estate is having bubble valuation problems of its own right now. All my rich friends who own real estate are selling their worst properties, and they're getting bids that come in higher than their highest expectations, and people are competing to take these things off their hands. I do not find it exciting, and it certainly doesn't fit Berkshire. Name me a lot of C corporations that have been passive holders in real estate and have done well over a whole lot of years. It's almost a null class.
Yeah, Charlie and I mean both, more Charlie than I, we've had certain personal real estate investments over time, and it's a field that in general we understand. We don't bring that much special to the game, but we understand it. We've made money in it. And actually, at the time that the NASDAQ about hit its high, REITs were quite cheap in my view, and I have less than 1% of my net worth outside of Berkshire, but basically I had that portion all in REITs. They were all small ones at that time, but they were selling at discounts. At that time, they were selling at discounts to the values of properties, and those values of properties were much more conservatively figured than today. Today, you have very fancy prices on real estate, and on top of that, you have the REITs often selling at a premium to those. So I regard REITs as quite unattractive now, certainly compared to 5 or 6 years ago. But that's a group of securities.
So that's for an individual, you regard them as unattractive.
Yeah.
And for a corporation, that much more so.
Yeah, right. The situation's changed dramatically from 5 or 6 years ago. I mean, the stock market, in many respects, from the 1999-2000 period is down significantly. REITs are up significantly. REITs were very unpopular 5 or 6 years ago. Now they're popular, and it's better to pay attention to something that is being scorned than something that's being championed. And there's really been a big change in the REIT situation in the last 5 or 6 years.
And the REITs have phony accounting.
Otherwise, we love them.
Yeah.
You don't want to bring up anything in these meetings. Number 9.
Good afternoon. My name is Carlos Locke. I'm from Lawrence, Kansas. The U.S. has had a dominant role in the world economy for about 100 years. Its dominance resembles that of an economic monopoly. Would you say that the U.S. is, quote unquote, a castle with a moat? And if so, how can we make the moat any bigger? Thank you.
Yeah, well, the U.S. has been pretty remarkable, as I indicated in my earlier comment. I mean, essentially the same population pool pretty much, and they've garnered over this 215-year period a remarkable share of the world's wealth. And it's an interesting question as to just why this group of people here have been able to do so much better than the rest of the world, considering we're not any smarter or anything of the sort. it's not an economic castle anymore. I wouldn't call it that. What we do is no secret. And I think that the relative importance of America, I mean, we have been a dominant factor in the world in post-World War II, and I think it will decline somewhat, although I'm not an alarmist on that. But I think to some extent the rest of the world, or much of the rest of, or some of the rest of the world, is catching on and adopting sort of best practices, as they say in industry. And our castle will grow in size, but there will be more castles around it, and I basically think that's a very good thing for the world. I think the more prosperous generally the rest of the world is, the better generally it will be for us. And I've talked about our trade problems. The more trade we have, the better. We had 1.1 trillion of real trade last year in the country. We would have with the world, and then we had another 600 billion, 6/10 of a trillion, that unilaterally we bought. Well, I would love to see the 1.1 trillion grow and grow and grow. It'd be good for us and good for the rest of the world. But I don't think that our prosperity will come in the future will come at the expense of the rest of the world at all. I do think that there were parts of the world that will grow economically from a lower base, but much faster than the U.S. And basically, I think that's a good thing. I mean, there's 6 billion people in this world, and a lot of them don't live very well. And I would hope that 20 or 50 years from now, that a higher percentage of them would live well, but I don't think it comes out of our hide at all. Charlie?
Well, I don't think it comes out of our hide in that sense, but if we're well, I don't think it comes out of our hide in that sense, but if we are now the richest and most powerful nation in the world, and 50 or 100 years from now, we're now the richest and most powerful nation in the world, and 50 or 100 years from now, we're a poor third to some country in Asia. Sure, we're richer, but it's a peculiar type of richness where you've lost your relative position in the world. It's not all. I think if I had to bet, I would bet that the part of the world that does best is Asia in terms of percentage gains per annum. And I think it might do amazingly well if it doesn't blow up in some way. And if it does amazingly well, it will eventually be a much richer place than ours.
Number 10.
Good afternoon, gentlemen. I'm Thorsten Kramer from Cologne, Germany. You have criticized the extraordinarily large stake that the financial sector in the United States is currently representing in relation to GDP, which is also reflected in a total credit volume exceeding GDP by roughly 250%, significantly up from the level we've seen a decade ago. A current account deficit and budget deficit running at 6% of GDP in combination with a still accommodating easy money policy and high asset prices will have to be consolidated sooner or later. How do you think the adjustment will take place? What are your two most likely scenarios how these huge imbalances might be consolidated, and is the dollar devaluation scenario your most favorite one?
Well, as I said earlier, I don't see how the situation resolves itself with a stronger dollar. Most people still seem fairly sanguine about the fact that there won't be anything terribly bumpy about it, that there'll be the so-called soft landing. And I don't know whether that'll be the case or not, but I would say that we're running the risk of having markets that could get chaotic if certain events converged, superimposed upon those factors that you just listed. But I'm not an Armageddon type at all on the economy. I mean, the things you named are important factors. I think that absent something happening in the terrorism field, I think that, the citizens of the United States, on balance, will be living better 10 years from now than now, and 20 years from now than now. But I do think that we're following policies that are unwise. But we've done that plenty of times over history. I mean, Peter Lynch has always said, buy a business that's so good that an idiot can run it, because sooner or later one will. We've got a country that's so good that we can have policies that are counterproductive, and we'll still come out okay. Just think of what we've had over the years. I mean, Warren Harding, Chester Arthur. We've had a lot of things in this country. We had a civil war. We had all kinds of things over the years. But the society has marched forward with some fits and starts, but still at a very significant clip. The real GDP per capita is 7 times in the U.S. what it was 100 years ago. Just think of that, 1 century in the human pageant and a 7-fold increase in GDP per capita. It's remarkable. So I acknowledge, consumer debt doing what it's done and the trade deficit being what it is, and I think that those things, particularly the trade deficit, should be addressed and promptly. But I don't think they pull down the whole place. They may create very severe dislocations in financial markets from time to time. But that's been the history of this country. I mean, we have had very dramatic things happen in financial markets over the years, and the country survives despite that. And sometimes there's great opportunity in those dislocations. There's likely to be. So I'm not pessimistic about the U.S. at all. I can't imagine any place that I would rather be. But when you say the 2 most likely outcomes, I think the eventual outcome is that the country does fine. But I think there's a significant possibility, and that you do have some chaotic financial markets at one time or another. But we've had them historically. Charlie?
We don't have any great record as macroeconomic. We don't have any great record as macroeconomic predictors, and I don't see any reason why we should really start now. Predictors, and I don't see any reason why we should really start now. Obviously, there are more chances for convulsion now. I mean, everybody from Paul Volcker on has looked at the current figures and said we could have some kind of convulsion as a consequence of forces now in being. Apart from knowing that, we have no contribution to make.
Yeah, I do think, as I mentioned earlier, that far greater sums relatively in one asset class after another are held by people where it's really on a hair trigger type mechanism. So the creation of lots of new financial instruments, the piling up of huge amounts by intermediaries or agency activities in terms of money management, I think they lend themselves to more explosive outcomes on any given day than might have been the case some years back when I was selling utility stocks to people 100 shares at a time in Omaha. I mean, that money was not on a hair trigger basis. But as you turn it over to fund managers who think their job is to beat the S&P on a short-term basis, you are getting very short time horizons on huge amounts of money. And those people may think they are operating independently in one sense, but they're responding to the same stimuli. And they can, as they did in the fall of 1998, they can all head for the exits or try to head for the exits at one time. And the thing about financial instruments is there is no exit. I mean, the only way that you get rid of a the only way you leave your seat in a burning theater in financial markets is to find somebody else to take the seat. And that is not always easy. In financial markets is to find somebody else to take the seat. And that is not always easy.
Go ahead. I think it's also true that the amount of credit being used, not only by hedge funds but by ordinary investors, is way heavier than most people realize. It wasn't even controversial in this country when we came to introduce single stock futures and what, commonly traded puts and calls. And ordinary people got in trouble. If I'd been running the country, I never would have allowed that. I don't know what good it does for the country to have a wonderful lot of trading in puts and calls. One of my children knew a nice man who had a $2.5 million house and $5 million worth of wonderful securities, but he couldn't live as comfortably. He never worked, as he liked to live on the income from his $5 million of securities. And he got in the habit of picking up easy money with the credit systems of the world. He kept selling naked puts secured by his account, including puts on a whole lot of internet stocks. And in due time, he didn't have the $5 million of securities, and he didn't have the house, and he now works in a restaurant. That kind of self-destruction wasn't possible before we created all these wonderful trading opportunities involving credit. It was not a smart thing for this country to do, to legalize gambling everywhere and to bring it in a more facile form into our investment practices.
Is there anyone we've forgotten to offend? I mean, we don't want to miss anyone. Number 11, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Vice Chairman. My name is Andy Peake. I'm from Weston, Connecticut. Recently, we have seen a number of corporate boards take forceful action, Hewlett-Packard and Boeing, for example. We have also seen board members from WorldCom pay large amounts to personally settle lawsuits. Today, we see Morgan Stanley embroiled in a bitter battle, largely based on divergent views of how to govern the firm. What responsibilities do directors have in this new environment, and what do you look for in your directors?
Charlie, why don't you take that one first?
Well, we are completely out of step with modern practices with directors. The modern practice is to have one from each diversity category and to have a whole lot of people who need more or less the $100,000 or $200,000 per year that they're paid for being a director. And people think this makes the system better. At Berkshire, all the directors are rich, and they own a lot of stock in Berkshire, and they're all very smart, and they don't get any liability insurance provided by Berkshire. So we've been waiting for our system to spread, but we seem to be losing.
Yeah, it's a tough job at times to be a director. The real problem that you can face and may often face is when you're dealing with mediocrity. I mean, if you have a baseball team and you have a 240 hitter in the majors, 240 hitter in the majors is still a pretty good baseball player. But if your job is to have a winning team, you get rid of them. And you find somebody that can bat 280 or 290 and field just as well. In business, the tough part is to get rid of something a notch or two above mediocrity, but not the best one that could be found. And when people meet every couple of months, they come from different parts of the country, and they have the normal social instincts. They don't like to have rump meetings or to sort of talk behind people's backs. It's very difficult for a group, and particularly if it's a group like Charlie described, where a significant number of them, the directors' fees they earn are important to their well-being, and they'd love to be recommended for another board and add another $100,000 a year to their income. It's very difficult for somebody to lead a charge and all of a sudden start at the meeting or trying to arrange a rump meeting of some sort to say, we really think this guy at the head of the table is no good. And